everyone. My name is Kelsey Forrest, and I'm here tonight with Dark Journalist Daniel Liszt. And we're going very deep into the new breakthroughs of JFK's enigmatic final speech, which he never was able to deliver, and how it's going to change history forever.
It's great to be here with you, Kelsey.
I'm excited.
Yeah,
Can I dive in?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because I'm excited.
This is going to be special. I'll tell you, there's some material here that does actually change history. And so that's really going to be something special for us tonight.
I'm so ready. All right, question one. So, first question. 61 years after the assassination of President Kennedy, the government still maintains the discredited lone gunman explanation of Lee Harvey Oswald as the alleged assassin. Why do they continue to hide the pertinent facts of the crime of the century?
It's an incredible story, if you think about it. And there's nothing really that parallels it in history where a government withholds information for 61 years.
And keeps holding it.
Yeah, on such an important case, the presidency and the removal of a president. So we know on our side, when we think about this, it's become a punchline, and everything about how the government would lie about something always goes back to the JFK assassination, things like the magic bullet, for example. And so the discredited Warren Commission, interestingly enough, turned 60 in September. And it's quite fascinating because when you think about what they came out with, it was 888 pages. But there was nothing in it that said anything beyond, this is a lone gunman, he got away with it, he got around Secret Service, and all the questions about the autopsy of President Kennedy, the unusual surroundings, the Secret Service stand down, all of these unusual things were just left out. And they got into interviewing all of these people and going deep into the minutia and obscured the case. And at the end of the day, they said, oh no, there was nothing there to see except Oswald somehow got a job on the parade route of the president's limousine 6 weeks before President Kennedy was going to go down that parade route, even though nobody knew he was coming. So the extraordinary coincidence is a little too much of a coincidence, and it spurned how many conspiracy theories? Well, that's interesting too, because those have been managed, as we'll see. And when you get to the actual truth of what was happening that day for President Kennedy, we're going to find out that he was heading somewhere to speak to a certain person, and it's on the record, and they were going to give a speech together. And that brings us to kind of the place we are today, which is about the final speech that he never gave.
Who was physicist Lloyd Berkner, and why was JFK on his way to the Dallas Trade Mart to give the major speech with him in a large ceremony just before he was assassinated?
This is interesting because of all the details that we hear about in network specials and historical overviews and everything else about the JFK assassination. You always hear about, he was going there to mend fences politically and this and that, but what was he actually going to do? What was he on the way to do when he got assassinated there in Dealey Plaza? And the truth of that is quite fascinating because the person he was going to meet is a character that I've focused on in my own research because he shows up as this kind of Zelig type figure throughout history, and his name is Lloyd Berkner. Now, I dug into the background of that ceremony that was going to take place at the Trade Mart. And the Trade Mart, I can say this also, it's an unusual place for President Kennedy to have gone because of the multiple security holes there. There's so much in and out and easy access for somebody who would be an assassin, for example. But it was all set up and it was going to be a major speech. And what I found out was that Berkner, after the fact, wrote to his students there and said, we are very disheartened by this. President Kennedy was going to have given a speech here with international implications that were staggering. So then I got very curious about the speech and his final speech that he never got to give. And it was absolutely powerful, the amount of obfuscation around that speech and how it was moved through various channels till it didn't show up until 1969. And when it showed up, suddenly it was a pro-nuclear, pro-war, completely un-Kennedy speech that didn't make any sense. So his actual speech disappeared into the ether, and I got very curious about it.
Until you were able to locate it.
Yeah. This is the interesting thing. And when we get into that speech, as we're going to get to tonight, we're going to see the reason that he's meeting with Berkner is because he has something very huge to announce. And it relates to technology, it relates to space, and it relates to some of the background that Berkner had. And that's going to lead us into Berkner's background. What I want to say about Berkner right off the bat is that this is someone who at the age of 22 went to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd and his famous expedition. And as a radio operator, he set up Little America in Antarctica before anyone really had done anything extensive there in terms of expeditions. He was there for 2 years with Byrd. So we already have a very unusual character in terms of his background. And Byrd, when he writes his book about Little America and his expedition, the actual note inside the book and who it's dedicated to is Berkner, who he says, thank you for your loyal companionship. Thank you for, being able to do this incredible mystery with me. So we know instantly their relationship goes on a deep level in terms of the type of secrecy that was required in that mission. And Berkner, at the age of 22, as a radio whiz, shows up there in history. And as we follow and track him through history, he shows up also again in World War II. And he shows up in 1952 heading up the Robertson Panel, which is the first major CIA investigation of the UFO file. So even though it's the Robertson Panel, many people said, well, Berkner actually led it. So they're tapping this guy along the way. He's Antarctica, he's the UFO file, and then he sets up in 1957 the International Geophysical Year. And the IGY, as they called it, was absolutely revolutionary for its time because it brought all these scientists together to go to Antarctica and measure the ionosphere. So he's in the middle of that. He's in the middle of the Robertson Panel. He's in the middle of the Byrd expedition. And then he's the person that President Kennedy is going to meet at the Trade Mart as he's about to be assassinated.
There's a lot of parallels there.
It's something else. It's incredible.
So what was Majestic 12, or MJ-12, UFO secrecy group, and how was Lloyd Berkner involved?
This is interesting because Berkner, there are a series of documents that came out in the 1980s that were called Majestic 12, and it was all about a group of 12 individuals who managed the UFO file. Now, the documents themselves have been verified over the years, and then other documents that imitated them came out to kind of obfuscate what was going on there. But what's fascinating is I went into the history of a physicist who was working on a very deep level with the subject of the UFO file. But he was a respected physicist in the 1950s named Robert Sarbarger. And, we talk about the Oppenheimer movie that came out last year. This guy was on the same level as Oppenheimer, and he's on the cover of Time magazine. He's the celebrated physicist. But his story goes underground as soon as he starts talking about the UFO file. And as a matter of fact, you can't find a Wikipedia page on this guy now. So he's been kind of rubbed out of history. But what he said basically backed up exactly what the Majestic 12 file said, which is that there was a group that studied the UFO file, managed the technological innovation of it, and passed that secrecy along. And what he was upset about by the 1980s is very interesting. Because when you get to the 80s, he's saying, why hasn't all this been released? I was working on it in the 1950s. He meets a very unusual end, interestingly enough, as a lot of the people involved in that level of secrecy around the UFO file get into. And when we talk about the UFO file, we talk about it from a couple of different angles because very often people go to the ET level. They're instantly thinking, well, it's an alien visitation or whatever it would happen to be. But I think what we can do here is combine that with the idea that we're also talking about an advanced group here working technologically in the background. And that's where I think Berkner is going to lead us a trail of breadcrumbs to find that out.
As he already is.
As he is. Little did he know.
We're all done. So what is the deep connection of the famous Antarctic explorer, Admiral Richard Byrd, to Lloyd Berkner at the JFK assassination?
This is fascinating because Byrd takes Berkner under his wing at a very early age, as we mentioned.
22.
22. And if you think about your experiences at 22, going to Antarctica for 2 years is pretty incredible. It'll leave quite a mark on your life. But what I found when I was dealing with Berkner and Bird is that over and over again, including the fact that they both went back to Antarctica in 1956, was quite fascinating. It showed that relationship continued on. But the relationship as it gets into the JFK assassination is quite interesting, because everywhere I looked into the crime of the JFK assassination, I kept finding people associated with two things: the UFO file and Antarctica. And I tried to put together, why would Antarctica be a part of it? But I'll give you an example. So when Lee Harvey Oswald signs up for a job at the Texas School Book Depository, and we're here at the 61st anniversary of the crime of the century, last century, he's walking in and signing up for a job, and the owner of the building is someone who heads up an experimental aerospace company named LTV, Ling Temco Vout. And that company, it's very interesting, I'll say this as an aside, they invested $3 million shortly before the Kennedy assassination. And they ended up being one of the largest Vietnam War contracts, making all of these various aerospace devices. So that $3 million investment from the owner of the Texas School Book Depository, who owned LTV, turned into $55 million by 1965. Think about the money, that kind of money in 1965. That's an incredible increase. But this is the kind of things that you can see in the background of that. But this character, D.H. Byrd, who owned the Texas School Book Depository, where the shots were fired from, allegedly, in the Warren Commission, his name was David H. Byrd, but they called him Dry Hole Byrd because he was an oil man. And he was the cousin of Admiral Byrd, who'd done the famous Antarctica expeditions. He was also the cousin of Harry Byrd, who was the senator who headed up all the NASA funding. So we're in an interesting place, I think, with this guy, right off the bat, that there's an Antarctica connection. As soon as they make that turn onto Elm Street from the limousine where the shots are fired, they're going right past a building that D.H. Byrd, whose cousin discovered Antarctica, those shots are coming from there. So D.H. Byrd, it turns out, funded all the expeditions to Antarctica. He's the main funder. As a matter of fact, there's something called D.H. Byrd Mountain in Antarctica. Well, that's the owner of the Texas School Book Depository. So when we get into it now, we're looking at an unusual figure who is connected deeply with Lyndon Baines Johnson. So that is the person who will assume the presidency when President Kennedy is assassinated. So you can see we're in deep waters once you start looking at it past the Warren Commission and past the superficial media treatment. You're dealing with very deep players. And obviously Antarctica is where the kind of high technology aspect comes in. But Byrd with LTV was already, this is an experimental aerospace company. And my basic thing around the JFK assassination is it's all aerospace everywhere you look. It is aerospace interests. Somehow, aerospace and NASA, that piece is where the JFK, the root of the assassination, comes from.
That is so interesting.
I know, we're into space, we're into Antarctica.
Well, and all the connections around it, too. So, how does Operation High Jump and Deep Freeze reveal an Antarctica UFO file link, and why are Admiral Byrd's secret diary and papers still classified today?
This is the thing. We talk about the JFK records being locked up 61 years later. And the main records that are kept on the JFK side are the CIA files. There's a famous conversation that Judge Napolitano came out with, and he's a big libertarian judge. He does a lot of TV spots. And he talks about talking with President Trump at the end of his term in 2020 and saying, hey, that thing you promised to do, releasing the JFK files, you going to do that before you leave? And Trump said, no, I can't do it. And Napolitano said, well, you promised to do this. Aren't you going to release the records? You don't want to treat the American public like children, like they've been waiting so many years for these files to come out. And what Napolitano said is that Trump said to him, Andrew, if you knew what was in those records, you would never release them. So whatever sits inside of those CIA records around JFK, there's a reason that they sat on them. And people over the years have said to me, well, wouldn't they be able to erase a document or delete it? Like, nothing's going to be in there when they come out. Well, I found out about an interesting meeting that Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time, the brother of President Kennedy, had with the CIA director 4 hours after the assassination at a farm in Virginia. Whatever booby trap that Kennedy put into those files made it so that if they took a certain thing out, it would set off all these alarm bells in the Justice Department and everywhere else. So this back and forth over the files has to do with the fact that there's something sitting there inside the files that would reveal a great deal. Now let's go to Byrd and his files. Operation High Jump is very mysterious, very unusual for a lot of reasons. One, it happens in the same year as the Roswell UFO incident, 1947. It's set up in 1946, and it has a lot of the very familiar players, including Admiral Byrd's son, and I'll get to him later because it's an unusual thing that he's there. He's a 22-year-old Navy guy. But he ends up being part of this team. Operation High Jump went down there. Now, this is 4,700 men. It is 13 ships. It's 23 planes. And this is all to navigate and explore Antarctica. All the records from High Jump are locked up. You can't get access to them. They're classified by the United States government. Now, you think 61 years is a long time to wait. Well, try almost 80 years. So there's something unusual about High Jump, but there always was. Here's a few things that leaked out over the years. One, they ended High Jump in only 6 weeks. They were supposed to be there for 6 months. They got out of there fast for some reason.
We still don't know.
The only thing that we have is a weird thing that happened with Byrd himself. So Admiral Byrd comes back to Chile after this, and he gets asked by a reporter what happened, what's going on. And he says, well, we're past World War II, but now we have to prepare to fight these new enemy fighters because we were all attacked by discs. And so the story spreads around everywhere. When they went to Antarctica, whatever it was that they saw, they thought, oh, there must be a base of another military here because we're basically under attack. Or you could say they were spooked enough to think they were under attack. They saw something quite unusual. Now remember, Byrd had been to Antarctica many times. He knew what to expect. So whatever it was that he saw when he came there freaked him out. And he said, we now have an enemy that can fly from pole to pole, so we have a totally new order of war coming. This is Byrd's testimony. Now, as soon as he comes back and gives that story goes all over the world. Well, they call him in for some heavy meetings and they say, you're not talking to the press, you're not talking to your family, you're not talking to the State Department about any of this stuff. That's the end of High Jump. You're not going to mention it ever again. As a matter of fact, Byrd only shows up again in 1955 in a TV interview. That's the only thing he'll ever do again publicly. And he says unusual things again about Antarctica, just saying it's going to save the world. Eventually, mankind is going to need Antarctica. But it's spooky the way that he goes into it, because what we find with him is he's a military man. He does not mince words. For him to have freaked out and shared this with this Chilean reporter, obviously, when he got down there, something was very out of hand, and they took that whole armada of men, planes, and boats, 4,700 guys, pushed them all back after only 6 weeks. And the question always remained, what happened to them? What did they see? Well, if you go a little further along the history, it's quite interesting, because Admiral Byrd's son, he was part of High Jump, and after his dad died, he inherited his papers, and he was going to open a museum and all this stuff. So what happens in the 1980s is he gets invited to speak by the National Geographic Society in Washington, D.C., and come down there and say, well, talk all about your dad, talk about high jump and everything that happened there. And he says, okay, I'm headed down. And he lived in Boston. As a matter of fact, it's a funny thing, I'll say as a little aside, that I worked in a cafe when I was 15 years old, and I had to walk by his house every day in Beacon Hill. And who would ever know it? But when I look back on the history now, I see, oh, that's the same house that I walked by every day. It was Admiral Byrd's son's house. So it's very interesting what happened to him. And this is what I'm going to kind of get into this idea of X-Protect here. He's going now, and he says, I'm going to give this speech. And his son lets him off on the train, and he set up a whole thing about who's going to meet in D.C. and all the rest. Well, he disappears. Now, he turns up a month later, dead in a warehouse in Baltimore, Maryland. He's dehydrated, he's malnourished, and he doesn't have the same clothes on that he left with. So all of the different explanations for his death don't make any sense. But what happened was, for some reason, he stopped in Baltimore, went to the warehouse district, got into a warehouse, and died, instead of giving his speech in Washington, D.C. about Operation High Jump. So we can see that there's a heavy, heavy level of tracking people who were involved with projects like that. And again, it goes back to this advanced aerospace project, which that is the thing that they've been testing in Antarctica, and we'll get into it. I want to say, to wrap up the story about the son, that the only person who saw him the whole time he was in Baltimore was the security guard at one of the warehouses, who said he was walking along with another guy and they were covered in soot. No explanation. He said, but the only thing that struck me as weird is he had one shoe on. And he said he asked me for directions about something, and I realized how well-spoken he was. And this is a very educated guy. He's like, oh, isn't it weird? He's walking around like a homeless person. So whatever it was that happened to Byrd's son is, again, part of this strange obfuscation of high jump, and the records we can't see. His idea of a museum is gone, and then he himself turns up dead. That has a very familiar ring to it when we get into the UFO file and experimental aerospace.
Yeah, you don't just end up in different clothes.
That's, yeah. The story's so unusual, and a lot of people at the period, New York Times, Washington Post, all these different, they looked into it and they seemed baffled. I think with a lot of those newspapers, they're so good at covering things up anyway. But even they were like, what's going on here?
That's a lot of open questions, but I'll leave them alone.
That's what happened to Richard Byrd Jr.
He walked by his house. Who knew?
This is the incredible thing.
So leading in, what are the secret weapons and anti-gravity programs being developed in Antarctica? And how do they relate to the deeper truth in the UFO file?
Well, this is fascinating. One of the people that we've had on the show is John Warner IV, who is the son of Senator Warner and the son of Catherine Mellon, who's the heir to the Mellon fortune. Now, what's fascinating is his dad was involved deeply as senator and as the director of the Navy in a program called Deep Freeze, and went there on many occasions. As a matter of fact, it's the only trip that he didn't take his son on because of the high level of secrecy involved in the Antarctica program. But his son started to find out as he was getting older, et cetera, that his dad was involved in Majestic 12. As a matter of fact, his dad, Senator Warner, was a member of Majestic. And he decided to ask him, I want some information from you about Antarctica, what's going on down there. And he said, I would love to be able to tell you because it will impact all of humanity. And then at a certain point, he said, all I can tell you is it relates to space. Now, if we go back in the record, it gets very interesting because some of the people deeply involved in aerospace show up in Antarctica. And Wernher von Braun, who is the rocket scientist that set up so much of NASA, was deeply, deeply involved and impacted by a book called Two Planets. And the book, Two Planets, started all of these German scientists thinking about a rocket program. If you go into that book and spend some time with it, it's quite interesting, because the whole concept is an alien civilization comes and live. It's a sci-fi novel from 1893. A whole alien civilization comes and lives in Antarctica. That's their natural habitat, as it were. And there's a whole thing about Mars and space travel and all this other thing. So it becomes a great goal of von Braun and some of these other German scientists to actually establish a rocket program so that they can go into space, but also Antarctica becomes an obsession of Nazi scientists and Nazi leadership. As a matter of fact, what they do is they actually hire Byrd and they say, we want you to teach us all the ins and outs about how to get to Antarctica, etc. Now, in the 1930s, when they hired him, we weren't at war with Germany. We were on a kind of a very comfortable status. And a lot of people won't remember this. But in 1936, the Germans and the Nazi Party hosted the Olympics, which is quite extraordinary to think about. And they televised it. So there's this whole kind of wave there where Germany was, still on the national stage. And so they hire Admiral Byrd and they say, we want to go to Antarctica and we want you to give us the ins and the outs. And they go down there and they claim it and they call it New Schwabenland. And New Schwabenland is going to be like their future territory. This is Valhalla. And they put all these kind of Arthurian themes and terms around Antarctica, strangely enough. But in the background, what we hear is they were developing a gigantic military base in Antarctica back then. And that by the time you get to Admiral Byrd going back there in 1946, that what he's seeing may be related to the military base the Nazis set up there. This is the lore, and this is also part of the problem with going into Antarctica, is it's such a mystery. It's almost easier to get information about things in space than it is in Antarctica because it's so, kept under. I've talked to people who've worked in Antarctica, and they are held in various skiffs and secure facilities and debriefed about things they can talk about and what they can't talk about. One of the weapons, supposedly, that was being developed there and that was used was something about being able to cause earthquakes, and so that was being tested there. And there was a gigantic earthquake in the region, and a lot of the people who were involved as whistleblowers said this is part of the test of the earthquake technology. Well, if you go into people like Nikola Tesla and you look at the things that he was doing, you'll find that he has a patent on a machine that causes earthquakes. And the patent comes from 1899. And there's a whole story about how he was dared, can you do this as a scientist? Can you create an earthquake? And he created an earthquake in Manhattan and even faced charges for doing it. So this technology has slid under the radar and is in a series of private interest groups in the hands of these groups. So we're going to try to identify who some of these groups are and how it relates to people like Berkner, like Byrd, like von Braun, who seem to have a double connection. They're related to the UFO file and they're related to Antarctica research as well. There's some strange connection going on there. And it's very easy to track it, but it's missing from history.
To be charged for an earthquake.
Yes.
Can you imagine?
And he did it. He also created wireless energy. So, they wanted to make sure he didn't go too far. You can't charge for that.
No. Well, so answer me this one. Why have high-ranking political, diplomatic, and religious figures been visiting Antarctica since 2016? And what did Apollo astronaut Buzz Aldrin see when he visited there?
This is fascinating. Okay, and when we get to Buzz Aldrin, I'm going to start with Buzz Aldrin because this is so unusual. He's the second man who ever went to the moon. Mm-hmm. A very accomplished astronaut, but he said some very unusual things, including the fact that, we found artifacts on Phobos and things like this. So he's let some cats out of the bag as an astronaut over the years. But he went to Antarctica in 2017. And it's quite unusual what took place with all this. He had to be medically evacuated. after he went there. But he was very active on his Twitter account, as he always was. And this is an older guy who discovered Twitter and was like, hey, I'm going to tweet away, talk about Apollo, talk about all this stuff. So just before he gets evacuated medically from Antarctica, he writes pure evil on his Twitter account. That's his post. So he got called down because of his expertise as an astronaut. There's no question. Well, if you look at some of the other things that happened around Antarctica at that time, it's quite interesting because at the end of the Obama administration, Secretary of State John Kerry goes down there. Okay, that's interesting. A religious figure out of Russia, so basically the Pope of Russia, he goes down there. And you have a whole host of people on these visiting missions to Antarctica all of a sudden. Well, we've been operating there for a long time in secrecy, developing various programs, anti-gravity programs, etc. But this seems to relate to some kind of discovery. And when you think about the people that are involved, astronauts, political people, dignitaries. People. Yeah. And you think about that. When you think about the astronaut part, instantly my conclusion was they found an artifact related to space there, like something that had crashed here. But there's no question that the secrecy around Antarctica went into high gear after this, after 2017. And as a matter of fact, what we get now around Antarctica is Lockheed Martin, who is really our main and most secretive military defense contractor. They have this huge presence there. It's like they've taken over Antarctica. So again, we open up the question why. And in my opinion, the only way you can get to the why, since you really can't go to Antarctica and investigate under normal circumstances, is the history of the people who've been there and the figures that are deeply associated with it. That'll give us kind of a doorway into what's happening with Antarctica and the fact that, in the modern era, that we can know of a place which is basically inaccessible to the public, but it represents a sixth of the world's landmass. It's quite extraordinary, especially with the history of the Maine explorers and all their stuff being classified some 80 years later.
The 4,700 man can't tell us.
I know. They're all under, and they're all probably dead now. 1946, they're probably all dead. That is a real tweet, by the way, by Buzz Aldrin.
That's our perfect next question.
I believe you.
Great. You've said on the record that Wernher von Braun actually predicted the rise of Elon Musk and SpaceX in the 21st century. When did this happen?
It's quite fascinating. And I want to put this out there that it's documented. It comes directly out of his book, Project Mars. So it's undeniable. The book was published in 1949, and it is a sci-fi novel, and it has all this technical information. And if you think about von Braun for a moment, we're taking him now from the Nazi rocket program where, they built the rockets, the V-2 rockets, to attack England and all that with slave labor. So he comes directly out of this SS setup. So we have to understand that about him before we bring him over through Project Paperclip and clean up his image and make him, the king of NASA, as it were. Now, when we get to von Braun, it's very interesting because through my work with Russell Targ, who's a physicist that developed the remote viewing program for the Central Intelligence Agency, he told me that when he met von Braun, he found out that von Braun's mother was psychic and that she would predict things and that she was well known as a psychic in the area, and people would come to her for predicting weather. They would come to her for predicting incidents, wars, whatever it happened to be. So von Braun instantly has an unusual footprint, as it were. And Targ said that von Braun came to him and said, I want you to develop an ESP testing device for NASA astronauts because those we send into space need to have this high intuition on the psychic level. So that's what von Braun told Targ. And he did, in fact, develop the ESP testing device. Now, it's very interesting because when I went back and read Project Mars, and there's two of them, there's Project Mars and the Mars Project, two different books, But there's a prediction in there about who leads Mars in this expedition that happens. And when they get there, this expedition from Earth to Mars, when they get there, there's a whole civilization set up there. And the person who runs Mars is called Elon. So it's an undeniable, sort of strange and unusual prediction. But here's the other thing, which is that Elon himself is obsessed with going to Mars. So now we have an unusual kind of crisscross here about, and you're going to find this predictive quality when you get around the Deep Aerospace players. I'll have another example for you before we're done today. But there's something about going into that book. When I went into it further, I found many of the UFO cases that would come up, the same names, Colonel Halt, for example. There's a lot of similarities in that book. L. Ron Hubbard's name, one of the commanders is Ron Hubbard. So we're getting into unusual territory when we're dealing with von Braun. But his comment about Musk is undeniable. And I'm going to have you read the quote because I brought it with me. And the quote, I actually put it up on the screen. This is from von Braun's Project Mars book.
All right.
So you take the first one and I'll take the second one.
Okay. The Martian government was directed by 10 men, the leader of whom was selected by universal suffrage for 5 years and entitled Elon. 2 houses of parliament enacted the laws to be administered by the Elon and his cabinet.
Werner von Braun, Project Mars. It's undeniable. So, is it a happenstance? Of course it could be. But then again, think about the level that we're talking on with these people. And also there's the strange psychic thing and the story that hangs out there in history about Targ saying, well, von Braun's mother was like this well-known psychic in Germany. I think we're in unusual territory immediately. And I think that also gets us into something about the mystical aspect around SpaceX and exsteganography, which, after all, that's what we're here for. This is the exsteganography series.
Well, so leading in, what is the secret ripple technology that was developed over 60 years ago, and why is it still classified today, like many other things?
Well, this is fascinating because this gets us back into Berkner again. When I was looking at the final speech of Lloyd Berkner with President Kennedy, I saw the ceremony aspect, and I got very into the details about the ceremony. Here's what was going to happen when President Kennedy landed at the Trade Mart. He was going to be greeted by Air Force One helicopter coming and taking a flag that had been flown over the White House, and it was going to be handed to President Kennedy, who was going to hand it to Berkner, and they were going to have a military command around them. So this is going to be a very special announcement as well, because he's handing over the flag of the White House to Berkner. So they're saying something international and of major importance is going on here. I've maintained the assassination of President Kennedy was related directly to his aerospace policy and his NASA policy. And when you get into those players in that aspect, you find Berkner sitting right in the middle of it, because it was Berkner who was encouraging him to go to the moon. And actually, in his favorite speech, we chose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. That's Berkner. It's Berkner wrote it and gave it to him and said, this is what you should say about it to get people on the same level. So Berkner, who'd been in Antarctica, Berkner, who'd been in charge of the UFO file on record through the Robertson panel in the 50s, he's instructing Kennedy about the space program and how we should proceed. Kennedy, in the background, is making major moves to share the information around advanced aerospace and the UFO file with the Soviet Union. A number of documents came out relating to this, and he wanted to do a joint moon mission, and he wanted to do a shared space program. So that gets rid of the space race, that gets rid of the Cold War and all the rest of it. So these people in the background looking at this, in the State Department, in the ex-protect type groups that deal with secrecy around advanced technology, they're looking at Kennedy horrified because he wants to share this. Also, I think the paperclip aspect comes in here because you have Nazis who've been recruited into our technological program, and they just fought a war with the Russians where they killed 25 million Russians in a low estimate. And here is Kennedy saying, Here's all the advanced stuff. I'm going to share it with our counterparts. And it's very interesting. If you look at the memo, Kennedy says, I'm going to do this so that we don't have nuclear incidents related to UFOs. So if a UFO goes over, let's say, a major nuclear base, they won't think it's an attack by the United States on Russia. So he has a very interesting, sound reason for doing this. But he is thinking we need to get together on this, and we need, as far as space goes, to do it as a joint moon mission. Now, Sergei Khrushchev, who is Khrushchev's son, confirmed on the record that that Khrushchev and Kennedy were getting together to do this. So Kennedy's in the middle of this program. Well, he finds out that there's a secondary program being developed in NASA, which I refer to as the Secret Space Program, SSP. And there's a lot of information about the SSP out there now. And not all of it is good. But what I can tell you for certain is the roots of it and how we can track it are through things that happened in the Kennedy-NASA era. Because he said immediately, you can't have a public space program and a private one. It's one program. So he actually goes to NASA and says, I will give this program to the military if you don't make it a public program. I don't know what you're doing splitting the program. The name of the program is Blue Gemini, and this blue is the secret space program that you and I revealed last year. Now, the government came out officially, this is on record, and said last March, oh, yeah, we have the blue space program. We don't think there was anything really dramatic about the blue space program, but it was a secret program that we had, and we're announcing it here. You know, that's in direct response to us putting that out on the record, because obviously questions got asked in those circles. So Berkner in 1963 at the Trade Mart in Dallas, he's the person President Kennedy is going to meet. And although Kennedy's records, and the speech were scrubbed, Berkner's notes have been unearthed. And what he said was the speech that they were going to give, one, was going to have international implications that were staggering. Now think about, Berkner and Kennedy going to meet him and all the things that Kennedy was doing with space. My suggestion is that it was going to be related either to a joint moon mission with the Russians or related to the UFO file. You can get real UFO file disclosure, which the government has had at least 80 years, probably a lot longer. But there's also false disclosure, which accompanies a UFO threat narrative. That's the thing that's being pushed out there for congressional hearings. The Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the NRO, those secret groups have their own narrative. And what they want to do is create a UFO defense office in order to generate billions of dollars to fight an imaginary threat. Now, the UFO file's real, but the threat isn't. This is the nature of the problem. So they love the threat part, but they will never tell you the real story. You'll never get genuine UFO disclosure from the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, the last thing was your question on ripple technology. Now, Berkner is involved here again due to his role as an overseer at Brookhaven National Laboratory. So there were a series of nuclear tests that the U.S. did in 1962 for Operation Dominic. Now, the test involving ripple was almost perfectly clean, no fallout. So this was the ripple technology, which is still classified, by the way, developed by scientist John Knuckles. And it represented an entirely new order of nuclear technology, no fallout. Now this would have decreased nuclear tensions with the Russians and gets into the secret X-Tech corridor. So there's some indication that along with the joint moon mission and the UFO file sharing aspect, an announcement on ripple could have been part of this. The significance of the White House flag in the ceremony tells us a great deal about the JFK Berkner speech at the Dallas Trade Mart on November 22nd, 1963. Unfortunately, it never happened.
So, what is the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., and why do you refer to it as the UFO Bilderberg Group?
This is fascinating. Cosmos Club sits in Washington, D.C. It's been established since 1870. And all of the major players who've dealt with the UFO file secrecy have all been a major part of the Cosmos Club. Now, Bilderberg and Davos and these times of meetings of these major corporate heads getting together represent a kind of secret piece. Bilderberg, for years, they got together and the media wouldn't cover it. And they would have all these incredible meetings, like the top heads of state, and they would, it was very often suggested that they selected the next president, et cetera. And the Bilderberg group had been around since the 1952. So I was like, it made me wonder, when these people were getting together away from the media and developing things like, prepping narratives, for example, social engineering and things of this nature, I said, where do they get together and discuss how they're going to play the UFO file to the public? Because as we've discussed, they've been developing a kind of breakaway technology. And at a certain point, that group that develops the technology, well, what do they have to do? They have to break back in with the advances. And then how do you explain it? So they're working out how to do that explanation. And I kept thinking, I wonder where over the years they've been meeting. So when I found a lot of the people involved, like J. Allen Hynek, major astronomers from the past, Carl Sagan, all these incredible people, over and over again, Donald Menzel, they were showing up in the Cosmos Club. And I looked into President Kennedy being involved, and he was a part of the Cosmos Club, but he resigned, which I thought was interesting. It made me think, he's resigning over the secrecy aspect again. And here we get to the core over and over again with Kennedy. He was not into the secrecy. He did a whole major speech about how the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. So they had a big problem with him going in. But the Cosmos Club, the founder, when I went into John Wesley Powell, I started to wonder, well, how about the founder? This goes back to 1870. Is there anything airship stuff related back there? And all of the major airship activity of the late 19th century that spurred, kind of the earliest UFO reports of all time, all were based around people related to the Cosmos Club, very interestingly. So the Cosmos Club represents one of those institutions that's still there that has a major role in relating to the early part of the UFO file. And it's fascinating because there's a character named Tillman who was involved with developing airships in the 1890s. And at a certain point during this whole wave of sightings, and there's massive reports, you can go back and check the reports, and it looks like these huge UFO waves over places like Texas, California, Ohio. Well, in 1897, one of these ships lands, and people are like, this is fascinating, what is it? And they go up to it, and a guy in a business suit comes out. I kid you not. And he says, this is our new airship. This is way before, this is like a decade before the Wright brothers. And he's flying this thing, totally more advanced than the Wright brothers plane. And he lands and he says, my name is S.E. Tillman. Well, S.E. Tillman was one of the high-ranking members of the Cosmos Club. And what you have, this institutionalized aerospace piece goes back. It goes back before NASA. It goes back before the rocket craze. There was already an established group back there. And that's why the Cosmos Club is kind of a key in all this.
That's so interesting.
Tillman, we could do a show on Tillman at a certain point, but whoa, what a player.
So how is Delshaw and NIMSA involved in early aerospace?
This is probably the most fascinating branch of research. And to put it this way, there was an advanced group back in 1850 that was already working with flight, long before the Wright brothers. So there's a figure named Charles Delshaw, who's an artist, actually, came over here at the age of 18 in 1850. And he was an agent for a private aerospace group in Germany called NIMSA. And I'll give you that, it's NYMZA. There's some in-depth work by an author named Walter Bosley on this. But what I'll say about it is fascinating is that Delshaw himself went deep into the entire situation. And what he did was he talked at length about what was going on with the NIMSA group. So what happens is NIMSA is sending him over as an agent to this group called the Sonora Aero Club, who are in California. And the Sonora Aero Club were advanced scientists of the period putting together lighter-than-air machines, early airship pieces. This culminates later in the whole 1890s airship wave. But what he does is, at a certain point, he starts to notice tension between the Sonora Aero Club and the group in Germany called NIMSA. And NIMSA suggests a weaponry use for the aerospace arrows that are being developed by the Sonora group. And the Sonora group are flight enthusiasts, and they're saying, we don't want anything to do with that. But they're operating already with advanced technologies that make what we've developed later into flight, the Wright brothers piece, World War I airplanes. This stuff was already far more advanced beyond that. So what's fascinating is Delschow disappeared from history in 1920. Then all of his artworks showed up in an antique store. Somebody had come across this stuff. And in 1971, an author realized the significance of the whole thing. And he started to bring out the images of the airships that were being developed in the 1850s. Now, here's where it all dovetails with the JFK assassination. It's quite interesting. There's a character named John de Menil, and his wife's name was Dominique Schlumberger. And what happened was she was a major artist and a major kind of humanitarian of the period and philanthropist. So she put the Delschow art on display with all the arrows and all the rest of it. Well, in the Garrison investigation, he went into Schlumberger, or Schlumberger is the actual name in France is. They were the biggest oil company, operating 75% of the oil equipment in the world. And he found out over and over again that they were related to characters like George de Mohrenschildt, the oil geologist who shuttled Lee Harvey Oswald around. And it seemed kind of unusual. Here's Oswald making $1.25 an hour, and de Mohrenschildt is a millionaire. What does he want to do with this guy? Well, it's quite interesting because de Mohrenschildt is an oil geologist and later turns up writing letters to George Bush, who's the head of the CIA of the period, saying, this Kennedy assassination thing happened. I talked out of turn about Oswald. Not all these people are after me. I wonder if you can get me off the hook. And he sends a series of letters to George Bush that are on the record from the 70s. This is like 10 years after the Kennedy assassination. So de Mohrenschildt gets a subpoena, and they say, we're the House Assassination Committee. We think you have information about Oswald being connected to the CIA. He gets the subpoena, goes into his room, supposedly, and blows his brains out. Now, there's a lot of weird things about de Mohrenschildt, including the fact that he was obviously assassinated himself because they had finally figured him out. But here's the strange part. The Delschow images came through Jean de Menil and his wife, who were these incredible art connoisseurs. Those are the same people who had set up and were connected with de Mohrenschildt. So the Schlumberger Oil Company and de Mohrenschildt in Houston were, operated on a very elite level, and they worked with people like the Bushes, etc. This is why he wrote letters to Bush as CIA director later. So you're looking at a dramatic crisscross, but in the middle of it, it can't be denied that de Menil is the same person who put Delschow back on the map. Here's the Aero Group again, back from the 1850s, NIMSA and the whole thing. And here's the thing. This is an Aero painting by Delschow, and it has two very interesting elements that are predictive. Remember earlier we looked at the Elon element that was predictive about von Braun's work. Mm-hmm. Well, when you look at this, what stands out for you is the name on the top. It says Trump.
Hard not to see.
On the bottom, on the right, it says 45, which is the art series, and Trump was the 45th president of the United States. Trump, 45, Aero airship, all in one snap. That's Delshow's painting.
Is that real?
It's real. It's in a museum right now in New York. It's been on display for 50 years, since the 1970s. Delschow has a series of works. He has over 500 paintings documenting the Sonora Aero Club Apparently, Trump was on his radar 100 years earlier. Figure that one out.
I'm trying to.
So you can see we've come to a pretty deep place in the middle of all this. That's what happens when we get into the aerospace aero aspect of this. It shows up, the crisscross politically, geopolitically, over and over again. Advanced technology, aerospace, and the political side. That is dark journalism.
Well, so when you discuss the groups controlling the UFO file and refer to them as X-Protect and X-Share, which we've talked about before,
Yeah.
what is the difference and how can we know who is who?
Yeah, this is very important. X-Protect is a group that will protect the secrecy around the UFO file and the advanced technology and its implications at any cost. So they'll destroy reputations, they'll change news stories, they'll change fortunes for people, and at the final step, they will create lethal consequences for people who challenge their program. The X-Share people, as I've called them throughout history, President Kennedy is certainly, wanting to share the UFO file with the Russians than with the public. He represents a kind of X-Share personality. The way that you can basically spot them out through time is quite fascinating, because people like Thomas Townsend Brown, who's a major kind of black ops scientist, worked on some of the most amazing black projects for the United States government having to do with anti-gravity and things of this nature. This guy is a major X-Share character, and he created NICAP, which is the first major UFO organization. He wanted to share the information with the public. Well, I got a chance to talk to his daughter and find out the level of secrecy and pressure that he was under. And one of the things she told me was that when they would ask him to do certain things with the technology, weaponize it, as it were, when he would refuse, he would be threatened, and he would take the whole family to a little island in the Bahamas called Eleuthera. And they'd be hanging out there surrounded by machine gun security until the X-Protect wave passed. And this is the nature of what goes on in those programs. If you're a scientist in a program like that, and you have an X-Share quality to you, then it puts you under a very difficult situation, because the people who are running the programs are all about secrecy, and especially when it comes to the American public.
Well, the fact that they're just willing to sacrifice, lives in a way, like the daughter.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's quite interesting because she had some interesting stories for me where she was working on a program with him, and she said, it was called the acoustic fan, and that it had all these amazing advanced properties, and she demonstrated it with him. And they went to the RAND Corporation, which is a major secret defense contractor, and major generals and people like Joint Chiefs, Curtis LeMay, and all these people came to this demonstration that he gave. And then the next day, he came to her and said, "You're going to Europe. And forget about the demonstration last night. Never talk about it again. And I want you to just forget all about this." And as a matter of fact, T.T. Brown himself kind of went off the radar shortly after that. She went to Europe and eventually got married, and all these things happened in her life. But when she was younger, she was his assistant. Well, after demonstrating that anti-grav technology for the RAND Corporation, that was the end.
That won't do.
Yeah. There can't be any sharing of that. And this is what gets us into the UFO file secrecy. That secret, we mentioned physicist Robert Sarbarker earlier. He said it's the highest secret in the national security state, higher than nuclear atomic energy. It's the top. And the reason for that, apparently, is this apotheum effect that we've discussed. So we'll get into that some more. But that is something that they feel like they can't control. And so the secrecy level becomes that thick. And I think we're in a period of time where people sharing ideas, on the internet, social media, where that type of secrecy won't work in a society like this. So they're prepping a narrative for how to explain that we've kept all this stuff under wraps for 80 years. And so far, it ain't flying.
No. How did we get here? Well, so why was President Kennedy assassinated over the UFO file?
This is really the crux of this, because again, the Berkner meeting, the final speech, the level of the ceremony around that speech grabs me, because flying in the flag from the White House tells me that his announcement was very likely related to space. Maybe it was the joint moon mission with the Russians. Whatever it was something that completely went off the charts, and he was assassinated before he got there. But on November 12th, if you go back into the history of President Kennedy, you will see that he asked the Central Intelligence Agency for all the, quote, high threat cases related to the UFO file. And that he said he wanted to share them because they were doing a joint program with the Russians. So therefore, for me, the direct correlation between the secrecy that they've been developing in the background and creating in places like Antarctica, which are so remote. We hear about Area 51 or whatever, right? But Antarctica is really, something goes down there, we won't know anything about it. And I think President Kennedy thought the public can handle this and there's a way to open up the public to it. But his first kind of lethal mistake in all of this thinking was that the groups in the background, he really thought he was the president. I guess this is the problem. And the groups in the background who were so dedicated to the secrecy aspect operated in that intelligence corridor between intelligence and aerospace. And it's very interesting because the only person who brought a prosecution in the assassination of President Kennedy was Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison, who was the New Orleans DA who went deep into the case, his final conclusion was that it's actually an aerospace intelligence wing of the military-industrial complex that did it. Well, that got lost in the mix somewhere along the line. I have a very interesting story about this, which is I did a documentary a few years ago called Agent Oswald, and it was all about his CIA role. And a guy got in touch with me who was a Watergate lawyer. His name is Douglas Caddy, and he represented the Watergate 7. He's a historical figure. He's in his 80s now. And he contacted me and he said, there's so many things in your documentary that were right on. He said, but I want to tell you this, that my friend was E. Howard Hunt. And E. Howard Hunt was the top CIA asset in the country. And I asked him before he went to prison over Watergate for breaking in at Watergate, what happened with President Kennedy's assassination. And then he stopped and said President Kennedy was assassinated because he was going to give our most vital secret to the Russians. He was going to share it. And Caddy said, what was the secret? And Hunt said it was the UFO file. That's a conversation that took place in private in 1975. And for me, it's more of that opening. And it's funny because recently I was contacted by somebody who worked in Kennedy's White House, and his bona fides are undeniable. He was a national security advisor, and he gave President Kennedy briefings on various matters. This guy, who came through a cancer scare, and he's a well-known figure, and he's just about 90 years old now, he went publicly and said, Richard Bissell, inside the Kennedy government, briefed me on otherworldly technologies. So that's a real dam about to break there. And we've had contact, as I mentioned to you. So this is opening up, and it is a 60-year-old secret that's going to blow wide open. So the question is, are we going to have the real truth about it, or are we going to have a huge narrative come out of the intelligence community? This is the battle going on in the background.
Well thought out fabrication.
Yes. Oh, yeah. The narratives are very slick.
let's get into some key figures controlling the UFO file and who were also involved in the JFK assassination, like Richard Bissell, Guy Bannister, and George Joanides.
Well, it's quite fascinating, and we'll take the last one first. All those figures are very interesting, and they're all deeply connected to the UFO file, but they're very deeply connected to the cover-up of the JFK assassination. So Joanides no one even knew that he existed. He was found by a Washington Post reporter named Jefferson Morley, who submitted the story to the Post, and they didn't want it. They said, oh, we don't want to get into this. But he had done all of this research about who was paying for things that were going on just before the assassination. For example, how did a full-page ad of Oswald show up in a newspaper immediately after the assassination saying, Fidel Castro sent it? He wanted to know things like that. And so he tracked back, and he found this character, Joanides. And it's quite interesting because the confirmations that he got led him to sue the Central Intelligence Agency, who said, yes, he was our agent. Yes, he was our top psychological warfare operator. But no, you can't have any other information about him. So this guy controlled the Oswald Project. He created a gigantic psychological warfare operation about Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald is a communist. Oswald is an agitator from Russia. Oswald is Fidel Castro's best friend, and he killed President Kennedy. Therefore, war against Russia or Cuba is on the table. This was his job, as it were. Interestingly enough, if you look into his history, later, there were going to be all of these hearings about the Kennedy assassination, even decades later, even into the 1990s. But in 1979 was the most crucial one. It was the test. It was the House Assassinations Committee. And the House Assassinations Committee demanded of Congress, give us the person who can give us all the information on the inside and vet it, etc. And it can't be anyone who was operational during the Kennedy assassination. And they said, no problem, George Joanides. This guy will do it for you. What they didn't tell the people who were heading up that committee is that Joanides created the Oswald Project. He was the psychological warfare officer who created the entire situation. So he was operational in New Orleans as Oswald was operational in New Orleans the summer before the assassination. And he was running a group called the DRE. And that was a revolutionary group. And the whole idea was they were anti-Castro, and Oswald was pro-Castro. Now, here's the mix and the historical problem with the whole thing. Going into the history of Lee Harvey Oswald, he worked for Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was the most right-wing FBI lunatic you can imagine. He was to the right of Attila the Hun. How was Lee Harvey Oswald working for Guy Bannister? Well, if you go into Bannister's history, you're going to find that Bannister controlled the UFO file, and he came up with the nomenclature X. He's the one who said, this is security matter X, it's an X file. That's where that whole thing comes from. So Guy Bannister, it's very interesting that he had Oswald in his employ. Well, Oswald, he was working at a coffee company, Riley Coffee Company, and he was telling all the other employees there, I'm going to work at NASA. This is just before the assassination. And I've got this great job at NASA set up for me. So Guy Bannister, the UFO file, Oswald, NASA. The other name on that list is Richard Bissell. Well, Bissell is the person that got fired along with Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in 1961. And the reason Kennedy fired them is unprecedented to fire a CIA director, especially Dulles, who was kind of the grand leader of the CIA for so many years. And Kennedy's conversation with Dulles went like this. He said, if this were the UK, I would have to go. But because this is the USA, you have to go. And Dulles was fired along with Bissell and his deputy director and this whole group of CIA people because they had tried to basically trick Kennedy into going to war with Cuba. So he got rid of them, but apparently Dulles remained the de facto leader of the CIA, even though Kennedy had fired him. And his lieutenant was Bissell. What did Bissell do in the 1950s? What was his program? By the time he got into the Kennedy administration in the 60s, he was in charge of Project Blue Book. He was in charge of all the secret UFO programs that we had. So Bissell shows up as this character that they called the mayor of Area 51. And he is somebody directly related to this piece around the assassination of JFK. So whenever you get into this and get into these figures, you're finding them associated with satellites, and you're finding them associated with Antarctica, you're finding them associated with the UFO file and the advanced technology that's wrapped in it. So it's very interesting when I was mentioning the various things that the physicist Berkner had done. He was the one to announce that Sputnik had happened. So it's the first satellite. This guy showed up in history all over the place. But when you look at these figures who are closely around the JFK assassination and you see the undeniable thread of them being associated with the secrecy of the UFO file, you have to conclude the aerospace groups were deeply involved in the assassination. There's no way around it.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll hold off. Well, so you've described the Apotheum effect as the biggest secret inside the UFO file. Can you describe what it is and why the deep state factions in the government are so loath to have it disclosed?
This is it. Apotheum, and this is the name I've given to it.
Yes.
But I've heard the effects and how they're described. One of the things that happened to me very early on is I knew Professor John Mack, but I knew his assistant, and his assistant introduced me to Mack on several occasions. Mack was the Harvard psychologist, and he put everything into the idea that aliens are real, UFO file's real, and he was really lambasted for it in the era, if you look back on the stories, and they try to get him out of Harvard and all the rest of it. But Mack was a very interesting guy, and what he told me, basically, was that fundamentally it's an undeniable experience for the people who came into him from all walks of life, that they had had these different experiences. So Mack, kind of got me into thinking about this, the various effects that take place in a UFO happening. Time stops, people miss time. They're elevated through things. When they're abducted, they go through things. So these are all non-conformist to any known physics that we've ever heard anything about. People disappear. There's other things about the UFO appearance that I think is interesting. For example, when they show up and they land in a field, nothing will ever grow there again. So the nature of the effect of the UFO file, whether someone thinks it's an otherworldly, off-world group coming here to visit, or if it's a group here developing technology, there's an effect inside of the technology that creates this apotheum, and it's a reality distortion effect. So that changes the relationship to time. And over again, you find people saying, well, I was going down the highway and 8 hours later, I found myself in a different location or whatever. So you're able to change the nature of reality. So I've come to the conclusion after reading how they try to redevelop it and kind of getting into a lot of the ex-share scientists, that it seems to me that their ability to aim this technology is not foolproof. That is, there's kind of a boomerang thing that's involved with it. And the only thing I can conclude is that, they say the torsion physics, there's this level of physics involved, is so great that it makes the atomic bomb seem like a firecracker. And so the level of secrecy that Sarbarka said, this is the top program, the UFO file, that's the top secrecy program. It's way beyond nuclear.
Yeah.
What does that tell you? So it puts us in a weird place getting into this. It tells us immediately that apotheum is the thing that they're hiding, because I don't think just the idea of an off-world civilization visiting here is enough for the level of secrecy and the lethal secrecy that's often involved with this. For example, the assassination of a president. I don't think hiding the alien story is enough for that. I think it's something else.
Well, if I'm nuclear.
Yeah. I know. Then what? Yeah.
circling back to NASA, is NASA involved in the UFO File cover-up and the development of the secret space program? And what was the role of a cult leader, Aleister Crowley, in its creation?
This is one of the most interesting things about NASA, and I think opens us up to the nature of it. Remember, I suggested that von Braun, with his mother who was psychic, there's a mystical element involved. If we don't get the mystical psychic part when it comes to the aerospace piece, there's a whole piece there which is their spirits of the air, their understanding of space. Even in the drive of SpaceX and Musk, the language is very mythical. It's Arthurian. So when we get around Crowley, it's very interesting because, of course, he was the great beast himself, and he put out all these major black magic books. He led the OTO. He was the most sinister figure you can possibly imagine. How does he have anything to do with aerospace and rockets and being in the heavens and all the rest? Well, it turns out that the person who started off our rocket program was Jack Parsons. And Parsons had a very interesting relationship where he started the branch in California of the first OTO. And the OTO is Aleister Crowley's occult organization. And there's all this incredible setup of, this warm relationship between Parsons and our friend Crowley. Now, Crowley has something in a book called Moonchild, a ritual. And it's the Babylon Rising ritual where you invoke these spirits and you basically bring in, it's kind of a Rosemary's Baby type thing. And Parsons was following along with Crowley, trying to do this with a very interesting companion, shall we say. So the ritual that they enacted took place in 1947 in the New Mexico desert. In the New Mexico desert in 1947, we get all the reports of the UFO file. Suddenly, everyone wants to talk about flying saucers and all the rest of it. There have been a number of people who've looked at the correlation of those dates and said, this is uncanny. Well, it's very interesting because Parsons, with all of his occult wisdom from Crowley, he became the foundational aspect of how NASA was created in the first place. And he dies in a strange explosion as well, somewhere along the line. It's just a fitting end for a cultist of that level. But I'll tell you, what's interesting to me about it is the influence that it had on NASA. And as a matter of fact, the JPL laboratory that they have is Jack Parsons' lab. That's JPL, which is, they changed the meaning of it to jet propulsion, but Jack Parsons has a crater on the moon named after him for all of his foundational work. He's the one. Well, if you go into Parsons' background, what was he doing in the 1920s and 30s, in addition to being so involved with Crowley and working on these rocket experiments, and really being an indispensable scientist in the middle of all this for Caltech? It's quite fascinating because what he was doing was having these intense long-distance calls back then with Werner von Braun in Germany. And in Germany, von Braun is back there, and he is, mystified by this whole process about how we can get into space. And he has all these mystical elements on his side, too. So we have a combination there of these figures, and it's a very, very deep occult tie that ties in Crowley and Parsons. But the person who comes out of that whole thing is not who you would expect, or maybe you would, but it's L. Ron Hubbard, who starts Scientology. He is close friends and a disciple of Parsons. And he's a prolific sci-fi writer. And after a while, he realizes, I'll turn Scientology into it. Well, Scientology has a heavy space ET component to it. When you get up to these higher and higher levels, you get information about space beings and things of this nature. Well, that all comes out of Parsons and Crowley. So you can see this wave from NASA, from Crowley, through Scientology. We're right in the middle of this gigantic mystery of how do all these things connect after all?
I have so many questions about that. Okay. Well, so...
That one, there's no question Crowley is the weirdest part of it.
Yeah, he just he took both and ran on out. Well, okay. So, do you think the latest UFO hearings with proposed intel whistleblowers in Congress will have any bearing on getting to the truth about the secret UAP programs?
No, I mean, you could say as a society, it's always good. And it probably does me some good from the level of research that I do that more people start to hear about the topic. But the hearings in general, the UFO Congress, the congressional hearings dealing with this, all the witnesses that they have come forward, they're like, hey, he's a whistleblower, he's a whistleblower. When I go into their backgrounds just a little bit, they come directly out of the CIA. They never left it. They're not whistleblowers. And they keep alluding to secret programs, and I'll tell you more. I'm going to give you the secrets, and UFO this and UFO that. They've changed the name of it to UAP, as we know. That's also part of their marketing campaign. So one of them is a character named Lou Elizondo. And Elizondo is a CIA counterintelligence agent. It's very simple. So he was part of Tom DeLonge's TTSA, and a radio station actually set up a debate podcast between myself and Tom DeLonge from, Blink-182. This guy was a rock star guy doing his UFO group. Well, they used somehow, when this came out in 2017, they were using Tom DeLonge to promote this idea of the UFO thing to the teen crowd or the younger set. But all the people around it were all, as I investigated his group, they were all CIA people and like really high ranking, directorate, top of the line, and intense experience. But without a doubt, they all were straight up CIA people. So I instantly said, and did a number of reports on it, and they got a lot of pushback, and they changed it around, and they pushed this guy Elizondo out. And then he lied to the public repeatedly about the various things that he was involved in. He said, I led a secret UFO program, and then I resigned because they wouldn't give the truth to the public. Well, he never resigned, and he never led the program. So those things are on the record now. And now when he goes out and he talks about it, because he has a new book that he's touting called Imminent about UFO disclosure, he says, well, I didn't lead the program, but I was a part of it. So, little
Who said I
things.
resigned?
Yeah.
Who said that?
So you have to take them. What they have is they're prepping the narrative, and the narrative on their side is we have a UFO threat, and we need a UFO defense office and the intelligence agencies to fight it, and you have to trust us, And by the way, that whole origin story of humanity, we're going to give you the real thing on that. Hey, you're going to get to nirvana with the CIA giving you the talking points of your own history. I mean, the CIA, inveterate liars. I mean, the worst liars. And they've stonewalled the public. So this rebranding is quite something. So that's what you get in the congressional hearings. I've talked to some of the people involved in setting up the hearings. And I will tell you that they don't know much about the topic. And that's the sad part about it. They
Not
just
the
like
UAP. Oh no!
Here it comes.
If the breakaway civilization or expert tech group have been working for 80 years, a long time, on programs or re-engineering the X technology in the UFO File, what kind of technology do they have that we in the public don't know about?
That is the absolute question. This is the crux of the matter. So we'll take 80 years at least. All right, that brings us back to the 40s. It goes even further back, but in that period of time, they've been able to work on advanced technology completely outside of oversight from the public, although the public has funded what they've done. So these are the black budget programs, and their excuse all along the way is, well, it's national security, it's got a secrecy level, there's no oversight. When we get into a situation like this, the problem is those people become a tighter and tighter and tighter group. So that's where the Expertech secrecy comes from. That's where the breakaway aspect comes from, because they start to say, oh, we have all these advances. Why do we need to share that with the public? And that was the original problem. And it came about through the National Security Act in 1947, which basically established the Central Intelligence Agency. And it said, you aren't responsible for illegal activity. So there's a charter inside the CIA which gives them carte blanche to do things that aren't legal. This is the nature of part of the problem that we face as a country, that the National Security Act set up these intelligence groups. And it's funny because if you go back and you read Truman's comments about it, it's very interesting because he said, well, I got dragged along into doing this, but I didn't want to create an American Gestapo. And that's what they became. So by the time you get to the Kennedy administration, he says, I want to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. So they're aware of an enemy there. The problem is that in the Central Intelligence Agency and inside of NASA, you have two big forces that are problematic. And both of them come from this aerospace paperclip aspect. So in that period of time, they said two things about Kennedy. He wants to share the UFO file, one. Two, he wants to be able to, smash the CIA. And sitting inside the CIA are the influence groups that came out of that post-Nazi era. So, Kennedy is on a mission to share the UFO file, and these groups are developing that secrecy in the background. In terms of what they have, this is very interesting because they've been talking about this Artemis program to go to the moon with. Well, we did our last manned moon mission in 1972. What have you been doing for 52 years? There's been nobody on the moon. We've had no manned space missions to Mars. It's funny because if you read the autobiography of Gordon Cooper as the Gemini astronaut who set up the Apollo flights, one of the earliest guys, the most clued in, he said, I was called in by Werner von Braun, and he said, you're going to lead the mission to Mars. You're it. Put it together. You're the commander. And he said, I got myself fit. I was working out this whole thing. He structured the Apollo missions. And he thought, well, I'm going to do this. And then at a certain point, someone came to him and said, don't talk about the Mars mission. Forget about it. Forget it was ever mentioned. That's it. And he was like, well, forget about this. I'm getting out of NASA. That's enough of that. And he ended up hearing in 1971 that in 1981, they were going to land on Mars, that they had the program set. And he said, what's going on here? And then it never happened. So there was a program there. Kennedy launched the program for NASA. They were supposed to go to the moon and then Mars. And then, basically create space infrastructure. The question is, what happened instead is that they created a secret space program with secret infrastructure. The public never got to see it, even though they funded it. That's why 50 years later, they can say, hey, we're going to the moon. That's why you have SpaceX, which is a privatized company after all. But all those things wouldn't have the infrastructure without the public being represented. The public-funded NASA, which set this up in the background. But we never got a space program out of it. The privatized space program came up. So that's how they developed it, through a secret space program.
I'm so glad we funded that.
How do you get the money back? This could be a good question for the UFO hearings.
It is.
Give us the money back.
Ask it.
Where are the missing trillions?
Where are the monies? So, if X-Protect is the CIA aerospace group responsible for assassinations relating to the UFO file, what other figures, in addition to JFK, were eliminated for wanting to share the UFO file? Like, who else was at stake?
I'll tell you a key one. There's so many. I'm trying to think of who to choose. There's that many. Morris Jessup, I think, is one of the most important. Jessup is interesting because he's an astronomer, and he writes the case for the UFO. And he, in 1956 and 57, has kind of legitimized UFO research. And they are afraid of him being a scientific figure who's doing this. So he is very close friends with someone named J. Manson Valentine. And Manson Valentine will show up on the radar in a very important way in the 1960s, finding the Bimini Road. And he's associated with all this deep research off of Bimini, finding exotic technology, as we covered in our Hot Zone episode. Well, Manson Valentine's friend Jessup says, I have something very important to share with you. And I'm coming down to see you in Florida to do this. So, in a weird way, kind of like Admiral Byrd's son, he ends up missing.
Oh, I was just going to ask, did he make it?
So he shows up in a Florida park, and he's tied the hose. The carbon monoxide kills him in the car. So somewhere between driving down to see his friend, being all excited to do this, he ends up suicidal, apparently, and kills himself in his car. Jessup had it that not only was there a UFO question, but that there were already interactions going on between the governments and an off-world civilization. So he was already advanced on this side of things. But he also knew the technology edge, and I think that they regarded him as too much of a threat. There's a series of ex-protect situations that we get into where the people end up over and over again dead. There's just no way to get around that. And I think President Kennedy is kind of the most dramatic example.
Yeah.
But ex-protect, they work, they're not just a lethal assassination group, but they have assassination as a major tool in the middle of all that. And, when you hear in this election people like RFK Jr., who his family has the background in the UFO file, President Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and when you hear them saying, I want the JFK files released and I'm open to the UFO stuff, that sends shockwaves through those groups. There's no question about it.
Well, so what is the goal of Ex-Protect and the Breakaway Civilization? Like, do they hope to become an elite space-faring ruling group and just leave humanity behind using the secret space program? Or what's kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Look, here's what they're trying to do. I'll boil it down. The original Nazi program around their space program was control of things on the ground from space. It's pretty close if you think about it. So all the things that on one hand can have really fantastic possibilities like Starlink and the satellites and all the rest of it. At the same time, they have the ability then to track everything. So every piece of that, when it gets into tighter and tighter totalitarian hands, there's nowhere to hide from it. This is a very old program. And again, the groups that developed it were deeply involved with aerospace. And their goal was, very simply, control of things on the ground from space. So space stations, low Earth orbit, satellites, all these different things that are being developed in space, and the infrastructure that's been developed in space under secret conditions that we don't have access to. And I bring up the story very often about Gary McKinnon, who is the NASA hacker, and his story is undeniable. He hacks into NASA, and he finds two things that are crucial. One, all kinds of information about the UFO file, and two, an off-world officers list. So there's an entire off-world officers division that exists, the public, that you and I don't know anything about. McKinnon, they wanted to prosecute him in the United States, and there's a famous occasion where Obama, at the time, goes and he's standing there with Cameron, Prime Minister of the UK, and they ask him, they were like, what about Gary McKinnon? They're trying so hard to get him. What are you going to do to him? And he said, oh, you'll find out, you'll find out. We'll go through normal legal channels to get him, but we're going to get him. They don't, because there's something about him having Asperger's, and there's some medical loophole that allows him not to be prosecuted in America. If he were, it would have been a Julian Assange style situation. So, but the reason they wanted to prosecute him is simple. Yeah, he hacked into NASA for sure, but what did he reveal? The off-world officers list. Now, people will say, well, we would know about that if there were a program like that, for example. I always go to the National Reconnaissance Office. The NRO existed. It started in 1961. It was not revealed as a program until 1994. 33 years, operated billions of dollars every year. And basically what it did was it controlled satellite secrecy, reconnaissance. Nobody knew anything about it. So yes, what is the organization then that's operational now that is doing something related to the UFO file that we don't know anything about? We could wait 30 years.
When is it going to be 30 years for us?
Right. Is it going to be 30 years? That's the question.
Well, so if JFK made it to the Dallas Trade Mart to make his final speech with Lloyd Berkner on November 22nd, 1963, instead of being assassinated, what kind of world would we be living in now? What do you think?
Well, I think that Kennedy had a vision of freedom. And Kennedy also was coming from a place that the more open the society was, the more progressive it would be.
Transparency.
Transparency, exactly. But I think what happened along the way was he was too far ahead of his time. And it's interesting because Gorbachev, who gave a speech at the Texas School Book Depository, which when you think about it, is quite unusual, considering it's the spot from where Kennedy was assassinated. So I think he was sending a message there in that period of time, because Gorbachev has gone on the record about the UFO file extensively, including the fact that Reagan came to him and said in Reykjavik during one of their summits, if we have to deal with the UFOs, like if there's a battle, will you help us? Gorbachev went on the record with this, New York Press Club. I have the clip. And he gives the whole story, and then he says, I'm sorry. Because the people in the room are stunned, and he realizes that he's dropped quite a bomb, but he's like, Reagan took it very seriously, and he said, if there's a UFO battle of some kind, are you going to help us? We're going to be joined together, Russia and the US, to fight this thing. Over and over again, when you get into this, you're going to find there's all this pressure around presidents not to get together with their Russian counterparts. So JFK and Khrushchev, he said, send all the State Department people away. I just want me and the translator and Khrushchev. They were upset at that. Reagan did the same thing. Gorbachev, I just want the translator. Putin and Trump did the same thing. I just want the translator. There was all this freaking out. Trump is a Trump puppet. He's a Putin puppet and all the rest of it. Whatever you think of that, it's part of that pattern, again, of them not wanting the president level to get together with the Russian side. Because in my opinion, the same groups that control the level of that technology do not want these leaders discussing the UFO file together on that senior level. So if President Kennedy had made it to the Trade Mart, we would have had the space part on a totally different level, and we would be living in a totally different society. I don't think there's any doubt about it. The UFO file, it was early to reveal the UFO file, but if he was revealing it and giving briefings and having all that happening in the background then you would have seen some kind of disclosure in the 1960s. Think of us now. Now it's 2024. Here we are at the end, right in the middle here of this decade. And we're looking at a situation where all we're getting is the CIA disclosure and, the congressional intelligence community version of this thing. It's 60 years later. So I think this is the nature of the problem. And as these pieces open up about Antarctica, about paperclip, about advanced technology, and about managing these narratives, I think people will come to their own conclusion that we're living inside of someone else's walls of secrecy. And inside of that wall of secrecy, we'll never get anywhere as a culture. That's still a hardcore control culture. So what you need to do is smash the secrecy. The way to smash the secrecy is to get past the narratives and even the false historical narratives. In this case, JFK was killed by a lone gunman who just happened to get a lucky shot off, a magic bullet, all that stuff. And what's interesting is Oswald himself, if you think about him and his background with Bannister, the UFO file, and NASA, he represents that aerospace link directly in the assassination. And I think that puts us where we are today.
We're entitled to the truth, but will we find it?
That's a real good question. Yeah. I think the pressure is on heavily to obfuscate. And but I think there are ways around it. And like we've pointed out tonight, some of the people even from that era are coming out and saying, yes, I was associated with that program. And as long as we get the legitimate voices, we'll be in great shape.
Well, so if the JFK assassination files that the CIA is blocking from the public after 61 years are finally released, let's hope, as RFK Jr. is attempting to accomplish, will Lloyd Berkner and the UFO files be in those secret records, do you think?
Yes, he's definitely in the records. And this is very interesting because when you have a figure like RFK Jr. looking for resolution around the JFK files, and you have presidential candidates pledging that they're going to open up the files as soon as they get into office, that sends shockwaves through that entire deep state operation. And so that's a big problem for them because on a family level, those people know. So if Robert Kennedy's son, you think about the knowledge level of Robert Kennedy working as the Attorney General of John F. Kennedy, he knows everything there is to know about the UFO file from that era. So I think that this is a major piece of it. If you get the JFK files open, the cascade effect that takes place after, especially relating to the UFO file, is dramatic. It is an avalanche. And so the question is, can they get it accomplished? Remember what Trump said to Napolitano? I couldn't release those records. You couldn't release those records. Well, can they be released?
And then what? Who else comes out? Who has other information to say?
Yes. I think that what we'll learn is that President Kennedy was assassinated over the UFO file. That's the problem.